Okay.
And we got 2 new participants, so now we are at 20.
Nice.
Okay, so thanks everybody for joining again. As I said, the summer course website has been updated. We have the new videos on there, and I will start sharing my screen so you, for example, see what I see. This is the website where we have the schedule and where you are invited to leave comments if you want. There are these embedded videos from last time. As I said, Farouk is unfortunately without audio for today, and that we will re-record it. Today's session will be about a virtual scan session, which might be challenging to do it virtually because we deliberately wanted to make it hands-on. Um, I will try my best, and then Farouk will talk about segmentation, and we will also maybe give some instructions for installing lenient softwares that we will go through next time. So let's start with the slideshow. Yeah, I think you can see my starting slide. Can you? Okay, Yamin is nodding.
Yes.
So this is focusing exclusively on the topic of the summer course, namely high-resolution functional imaging. And 99.9% of all the high-resolution functional imaging is using a single-shot EPI in the form of 3D EPI or in the form of 2D or SMS EPI. And if it's VASO or BOLD, it's almost always an EPI. So I will focus on EPI. And EPI is kind of embarrassingly simple, actually, that we have a two-dimensional K-space, and what the scanner does is nothing but just go through this K-space line by line by line by line by line by line. And this geometrical pattern is as simple as it gets. There's nothing more to it. And even like my 6-year-old nephew can understand that. But still, there's an entire science field and discipline about it, like how you best acquire and go through K-space back and forth and back and forth. So this is everything I will talk about, how we go through K-space back and forth and back and forth. And I will try to really focus on the parts that are unique to the high-resolution fMRI, specifically layer fMRI at high-field imaging, which means that I will somehow assume that you know what MRI is and that, in fact, you already know what fMRI, for example, at low resolution is. But this does not mean that you're not encouraged to ask me questions as soon as a single term is not completely clear. And Farouk encouraged me also to include a few additional slides about like the concept of K-space. So I will try to do that. If there's anything unclear, please do not hesitate to ask what this means. Specifically because this is supposed to be an interactive course. The very similar slides and the presentation of a more like online scanning session is also available on this YouTube link over here, where I will go through the same concepts as we will go through today. However, this YouTube video has been like video edited. There are no redundancies, and it's smooth and plain language. So in fact, if you are watching this presentation of the summer course respectively, you might be better off watching the YouTube video that I just referred to. Like if you don't have the chance to ask questions after all, for example, for Simona or Hannah or Till, if you have a bad internet connection, this might be a good reference. Also, this morning, Benedict Poser asked me, he's the head of the MR Methods group here in Maastricht, to advertise a new PhD position. I know that you are part of this course because you are already a PhD student, and most likely. However, you might know other people who are looking for PhD positions, and there are currently several open slots here in Maastricht. And the one that Benedict Poser is looking for is specifically a collaborative one in collaboration with Bonn and in Paris, Nicolas Boulon, specifically focusing on the technical aspect of high field imaging. Also, I want to announce, and I should have checked this with Farouk too, I guess, that next week we are going to do a hands-on analysis session, specifically with the software package Laney that we are both involved with. In case you have trouble installing it, I will be available in this very Zoom channel exactly 1 hour earlier. So if you have trouble and you tried it already and you failed, just join the Zoom channel and maybe I can help you with the compilation or download or whatever. There are instructions online already and referred to in the web page. So try those first. If that doesn't work, let me know. All right. So let's jump right in. As I told you, we are interested in this back and forth pattern in K-space. And the way how this back and forth pattern to acquire EPI works is determined by these parameters that we usually see in the so-called protocol editor. Here I'm showing you a screenshot from a VB17 70 magnetom scanner that we have available here in Maastricht. I know that in the participants from CMRR or from Paris, or no, actually I think Paris you are also still on a VB17, but from Liège certainly you have a newer system, the VE12 I believe, which looks very similar. You have these different task cards and sometimes even sub-task cards, and there are a lot of different sequence parameters that determine, for example, how many lines you have in your going back and forth pattern, how big your going back and forth pattern is, and then how big you jump between different back and forth patterns. And even though the geometry of this back and forth pattern going through EPI is so embarrassingly simple, there are a lot of different parameters, and these are just a few of them. And in fact, like the Siemens protocol editor allows you to change more than 100, which you see here, which is quite a lot. And the kind of tricky thing for high resolution imaging is that those 100 or more than 100 parameters are just the tip of the iceberg. There are many, many more hidden that the clinical user interface of the scanners that is not really optimized for high resolution fMRI, but more for clinical scanners didn't really show you. So there some of these parameters are important for us, but some of the more important parameters are actually hidden. And I want to show you how to access and optimize these hidden parameters. And before I show you some of these things on scanner screenshots, I would like to make a quick disclaimer that this is the way how I personally do it. So if you are on your scanner and your local physicist has a different way of doing things, maybe he has good reasons for it. So I'm just showing you how we do it here in Maastricht, which should not be misunderstood as being a scientific talk that this is the only way of doing things. The data that I will go through today are also available on OpenNeuro right over there, and they are acquired on VB17, Siemens Healthineers magnetom scanner, the older generation of actively shielded scanners from Siemens, the company here in Maastricht, Scanexus, and I will show you some extreme cases also from NIH, the section of functional imaging methods. I know that some of you are interested in the Terra, which is not that different, and I will try to talk about these Terra-specific things specifically. All right, so when you put a person in the scanner, like Artie here, usually you start by doing a quick localizer. And a very efficient way of doing this is for using the optimized localizer that usually the Siemens engineer, when they set up the scanner at the first time, gave you, is this, for example, the Scout or some sort of fast flash imaging, which is really, really fast. It's like literally 17 seconds. And it's good enough for conventional MRI because you know where the brain starts and where it ends. You know the dimensions. You can put your big field of views for whole brain imaging on there. For layer-dependent fMRI, however, that's not really what we need. Like for layer-dependent fMRI, we usually don't have whole brain coverage. Usually we have optimized protocols that cover very specific parts of the brain only, like a specific slab, for example. And we are interested, for example, in the motor cortex or in the calcrine sulcus to do a visual experiment. And with this kind of localizer, we don't really see that. So you are invited to use an advanced localizer, which is available on the Sequence GitHub. Maybe I can go there real quick. And like these are all the protocols that I have optimized for high resolution fMRI, and the advanced localizer is, for example, a standard Siemens sequence that should be available on any scanner and is just not loading right now. This is a PDF with all the parameters. You can install it on your scanners, and it's basically an inversion recovery turbo flash, meaning that you directly see the sulcus pattern due to this inversion pulse better than for the standard localizer. It takes a bit longer, but it's a 2D sequence, so you can just drag and drop images as they come in and then adjust your different slices along the way. So you don't need to really wait 1 minute if you're afraid of losing time there. And for these kind of sequences, you not only see where the motor cortex is, but for example, in the visual protocol that I focus here on in these slides, you then can better see the calculus sulcus and adjust your limited field of view with high resolutions, your EPI. Without knowing where this sulcus is, and with the kind of previous standard localizer, you have usually troubles. If you're more interested in a motor cortex, then you also nicely see the kind of omega shapes to adjust the slides accordingly. As you probably know already, the yellow box in the Siemens environment tells you where you acquire your images. So this is, I think, a slab of 26 slices, and everything within the yellow box is acquired. Everything outside the yellow box is ignored and not captured. The green box is usually the shim volume. And I will drink a bit. Apologies. So the green box is usually a bit bigger than the yellow box, the acquired slices. And this is due to the fact that the field map that tries to be used for your shimming, for the homogenization of the background main magnetic field, is not very high resolution. So the shimming, the homogenization is estimated, and then there are additional hardware, shim coils, that try to homogenize it. The field map that is acquired for the standard shimming procedures in Siemens is not very high resolution though. And this means that when you have a very small shim box and you make the green box as thin and as small as the acquisition, the yellow box, you only have like 2 to 3 voxels available. And usually the resolutions for these field maps are in the range of 3 to 6 millimeters. And the shimming, especially for the more modern systems, can go up to third order. So this means that you are trying to fit higher order, third order spherical harmonics to only 2 or 3 data points, and that obviously doesn't work, right? So I would advise you to make the shim box, the green box, a bit larger than the yellow box. Maybe also important to note here is that the way it is implemented for Siemens is that the shimming is kind of binary, meaning that your voxel that is trying to be homogenized with all the other voxels is either inside the green box or outside the green box, which is not really ideal for the purpose that we are interested in, namely high resolution EPI, but it's how it is. So for example, this means that usually we would be interested to have a very high homogeneity in the area of interest, like the visual cortex over here. For example, to have like maximum off resonances of maybe 20 Hertz. We can cope with off resonances, like in the front, for example, up to 50 Hertz. Because there, like the distortions, we don't care about that a lot. However, if we are far beyond 50 Hertz off resonances and have a very bad shim over there, the Nyquist ghost correction in the EPI screws up the entire K-space and even compromises the signal quality in the area where we care about back there. So usually we would like to have the highest weights back in the back of the brain, medium weights in the front of the brain, and ignore everything outside. This is not what Siemens gives us. Siemens gives us a binary box. So that's what we need to work with. All right, as soon as we shimmed everything, we can start with the first EPI experiments. And in order to run the EPI with the highest quality, we need to access these hidden parameters that I talked about earlier. In the VB17 system, this can be done by pressing the escape and control key at the same time, control and escape, and then you have these kind of Windows XP menu over there, and you can select the run window, which allows you to execute commands. For example, in the run window, you can type in Xbuilder. Xbuilder is a kind of editor that allows you to edit text files of these hidden parameters. For example, when we look at that and we navigate to a file that's called the iceconfig, which is located right over there on the C drive, medcom config ice config. This is the same for the Terra too. And you open it, then you get these kind of text files where you can change all the hidden parameters. On the Terra system, or for example on a VE system, you don't have the run window anymore, like here, but in fact you have the command prompt. Again, you press the Control Escape key and then use the command prompt, and then you need to type in your command like directly in your terminal. For example, here I type in XBuilder, and then it opens up the same kind of interface. So this is, as I said, a nice visualization of a large text file where we have a lot of different parameters that we can manipulate. And these are all the parameters that are kind of the same across any kind of sequence that you can run within your session. If you change anything in this file, the medcom config ice config evp, these values will be used for your entire session. As soon as you close your participant and register a new patient, this file will be overwritten, which I think is very handy, because if you screw anything up, the person scanning after you will not be affected by you that much. Like, they will still can start with a clean system. However, for us, this means that if we want to optimize one of these parameters, we need to do so for every little scan, and we shouldn't forget about it. And one of the parameters that I always change is in ICE, config, and iPad. iPad stands for the parallel imaging, and there they have a parameter which is called improved crupper. And as you can imagine, the improved crupper tells you that you're using a better version of crupper. You're not using the default version. And for very unfortunate reasons, it's switched off by default. By default, the parameter is -1. If you want to switch it on, you just change the -1 to 1. And this is basically using a different reconstruction and training algorithm for like when you use parallel imaging. So I switch this on for every parameter. And this improved crupper algorithm has effect on your data, of course, and I want to show them here. The effect is not like the main effect is not huge. Or I will just show you how it looks. So here I'm flipping back and forth between changing this parameter and not changing this parameter. So you can see that the shading obviously is different, and maybe this kind of salt and pepper noise is a tiny little bit reduced, but with the default parameter of using this improved crupper mode, it doesn't really give you that much. And you can see so in the TSNR maps. So here maybe like the ghost level is a tiny little bit affected, but there's not much huge improvement. The huge improvements that we care about is happening when, before I go to the huge improvements, and this is just another data set where you can like basically see the same thing, flipping back and forth. Maybe there's, like if you look there, you see that there's a bit of ghosting pattern different. It's barely visible if you don't know where to look for it. The TSNR overall is also not that different. The thing that is different, however, if you use this improved crupper, is that as soon as you switch this on, you have all these other parameters down there that you can now play around with. If you don't select the improved crupper, then all these parameters down there are just ignored and not used at all. And one parameter that really makes a huge difference in the reconstruction is the parameter that Siemens calls crupper noise reduction 1. It's a weird name for what it actually does. And what it does is it simply changes the crupper regularization strength. As you know, in parallel imaging, which we always need to use at high resolution layer dependent fMRI, we omit k-space lines. So we go through k-space back and forth and back and forth and back and forth by skipping lines. So for example, we only acquire the solid circles and we do not acquire the kind of non-solid circles over there. And then later in the reconstruction, we try to recover the non-acquired information based on proximity relations, because in k-space, usually k-space of individual coil elements is rather smooth, and this means that you can recover missing information by relationships to the signal intensities and phases in the close proximity. So you're basically having a kernel, and this kernel needs to be determined and fitted. And the proper noise reduction one is basically just determining your regularization strength of this fitting algorithm during the reconstruction. And the default parameter here is 1. When I do high resolution layer dependent fMRI, I usually change it to like 1000, 3000, much more. And the parameter of 1, the default, it just happened to be a very conservative, very robust parameter that works across any kind of setup. And this, so we might understand why Siemens chose this default parameter. However, for us, we are really pushing the limits here. We want more than just something that works robustly. For example, Siemens tries to be very general here, that when you do liver imaging at 1.5 Tesla with a body coil, and if you do sub-millimeter high resolution fMRI with microstrip RF coils, for those two different cases, you use very different sequences, right? For fMRI, you use EPI sequences. For liver imaging, you use maybe flash or whatever. So if we change the sequences for different acquisition parameters, why shouldn't we also change the reconstruction parameters? So this is basically what we are doing here. And we are trying to optimize the reconstruction based on the specific setups that we have. And at a high resolution layer-dependent fMRI, we usually have array coils, meaning usually we have a 32-channel Nova coil, for example, where we can easily go to larger regularization strengths. This means that neighboring k-space points will become less independent. And as long as you have small coils that are much smaller than your field of view, that's absolutely okay to do so. On the Terra, if you want to change this parameter, that's a bit different. And I think on the blog, I explained how this works on the Terra. So there's a blog post where I explain more about the background, how this works. There's some pseudocode from, I think, Matthias Schneider, who did a master's thesis in Erlangen. Like usually you don't have access to Siemens code or Siemens pseudocode, but sometimes there are chances like to look through master theses. Anyway, I wanted to show you how this works on the Terra. On the Terra, you have an additional field down there in your Twix, and that field is called the IcePad read ini file. You need to switch that on, change it from 0 to 1, and as soon as you switch that on, it reads in the parameters from another file, namely the file that's located at c medcom config ice pad configurator.ini. And in this file, this is literally a text file that looks like that here, where you have a lot of code and pseudocode, and this is actually quite well documented too. And there is one space and one line that's called the d-grappa regularization weight. And you need to uncomment this line. And for example, change this line from the default parameter of 0.0001 to, for example, 0.1, which then is 1000 times as high as the default parameter, which then refers to, for example, 1000 on the VB17. Note, however, that if you change anything in this file, the medcom config icepad configurator ini file, this will not be overwritten after you close your patient and register a new one. So if you change anything there, make sure to let the local MRI physicists know about it, and make sure that you always change it back to the default parameters. Otherwise, other people scanning after you might be seriously annoyed. All right. I have talked to myself a lot now. Maybe can somebody give me a thumbs up if you still hear me, or like I feel a bit weird talking to myself. Okay, great. So we can continue. So I talked a lot about how to change it, but how do the data look actually? Sorry, I will. So this is the default and parameters when we have this high parameter, like regularization strength 1. If we change it to 3000, flipping back and forth, here you can see that it's not only the weighting that's changed, but it's also the kind of salt pepper noise in the background. If we change it even further, then you can, like to 4000, you can see that especially in white matter, the white matter looks very smooth here already, as opposed to the 3000 case, which has this salt pepper noise, which I hope you can see. However, you can also see that the ghost level is quite bad already. This ghost level is usually not so bad for like functional imaging because they're very stable across time. And in functional imaging, we don't really care so much about how well how pretty the images are. We usually care about the temporal stability. So I'm willing to sacrifice and deal with these ghosts as long as I have improved my TSNR. And here you can see the TSNR improvement. So for the default parameter, the single digit TSNR values, for example, here in the white matter are certainly coming more towards 20. You can basically choose your TSNR. If you use 40,000 regularization strength, then you have even higher TSNR everywhere, but then the ghost level is so strong that it might not be usable at the end. So there is some sweet spot, and it depends on the protocol and your gradient interactions and the eddy currents, where you can get most of the TSNR out of it. And this is the same thing just for a motor protocol, where the default parameter, when you just don't change anything and run a high quality fMRI sequence, in this case I believe, your TSNR values, especially in the motor cortex right over there, are rather not really optimal. If you over-regularize your grappa, then the TSNR is significantly higher. Of course, you have more ghosts, but this doesn't really affect your signal so much at the end. If you go to a regularization of, in this case, 100,000, then you even have better TSNR. You can basically choose the TSNR that you want. And however, if you over-regularize, then the K-space points become kind of not only non-independent from each other, but they become copies of each other. So in this case, it's the same as just not doing grappa altogether, and you have a copy of the image copied on top of each other, which is basically averaging, and then you have a much higher TSNR. So you can gain a lot by changing the grappa regularization, and especially over-regularizing it. So now in the next parameter down the line that I want to talk about is, for example, the grappa kernel size. And in order to understand the grappa kernel size, I would like to back up a bit and talk a tiny little bit about K-space. So many of you might know this already. K-space is basically a Fourier transform of the image space. And K-space is what the scanner acquires. So the scanner acquires first this line going back, then the next line back. This would be K-space center, and then it's going out again. Now when we have a smaller K-space, for example, we take the same image in this case and just remove the everything around it, we get the same image. However, we are missing the higher resolution. If we even get rid of more of the outer K-space, then we again end up with the same brain, but even lower resolution. So these kind of simulations tell us that the size of K-space determines the resolution. And the inverse can be seen here. When we remove the inner part of K-space, we basically only have the high spatial resolutions and the high spatial frequencies without having the low resolution. So by manipulating different weights in K-space or K-space sizes, we are basically playing around with the spatial resolution. And obviously for layer-dependent fMRI, this is very important, and we care a lot about spatial resolution. So we care a lot about these outer K-space points over there. And this simulation has been done with KSPAP, which is a very nice app. I think it's for Android and iPhones. I'm not sure about Windows phones, but I recommend you to download it and play around with it. You can simulate grappa, you can simulate partial Fourier, you can simulate a lot interactively and play around with it to get a good feeling about K-space, which also then means that you can play around with different sequence parameter choices retrospectively. You can also upload your own images or make a picture. Check it out. It's cool and it's fun. All right. So I wanted to talk about the grappa kernel size, which is here. On default, the grappa kernel size is, I think, 2 by 3. And and this basically, this parameter means that for any missing k-space line acquired here, I'm taking a proximity of 2 by 3 surrounding points to estimate the signal within the missing point that I try to recover. So basically, one direction is always odd and the other direction is even. So we have 2 by 3 in this case. We can, of course, also use a larger patch of k-space. For example, here like 4 by 3 or something, that we also take these k-space points into consideration when reconstructing that one, which can help sometimes. And especially when you have specific areas in the brain that you care about. And I'm saying that with respect to k-space earlier because you might have learned that a small part in k-space refers to smooth images and vice versa. So when we have a very small kernel, the G-factor penalty, like noise enhancement that comes in from fold-over artifacts in acceleration in grappa, will be much smoother. So for a small kernel, for example, this might be a 2 by 4. The highest noise level that you have in the center of the brain is kind of smoothed out. So there's no sharp border between having a lot of noise and having less noise. When you use a larger kernel, we have sharper borders, meaning that there is this area in the brain over there that has a lot of noise, and then if you move like a few voxels outside, the noise level is much better. And this can be important, for example, when you are interested in a motor cortex. So here this would be the hand knob that I'm interested in. So if I'm interested in that area, I might want to use a large kernel, because then I keep all the high noise level in the center part of the brain, and the noise doesn't leak out to the motor cortex. However, if I'm like unfortunate enough and I'm interested in the SMA, there's like motor areas in the center here, then I actually want to have a lot of noise to be leaked away into other areas, so that the noise level in my area of interest is not that bad. So depending on kind of which areas you're interested in, you might want to play around with that, especially in the motor cortex studies. Sometimes I use smaller kernels. If you are interested in the visual cortex, you can use like larger kernels. And I want to show you how this looks like in real life data over here. So here I'm just flipping back and forth between different kernel sizes, and you can see, especially zooming in, that the G-factor penalties, the kind of grappa artifacts that you have in the center of the brain, are varying a bit. So especially visible again in the motor cortex, where you see that the noise level in this kind of ellipse back there is sometimes more confined than in other times, which might be better visible when I look at the TS&R difference between a small kernel and a large kernel. So you're not really gaining anything globally, but you can improve the TS&R in the center of the brain, as I said, by using smaller kernels and by sacrificing the kind of TS&R, the signal stability around it. So depending on where you care about it, you might want to change your kernel. All right. Another thing that we are usually forced to do with high-resolution layer-dependent fMRI is partial Fourier imaging. And in partial Fourier imaging, we take advantage of the fact that k-space is Hermite symmetric. This means that one side of k-space is usually a mirrored function of the other side of k-space. And some people call this asymmetric echoes. I think on Bruker scanners and Philips scanners on Siemens, we usually call this partial Fourier imaging. There's also a blog post about it and what it does. Usually partial Fourier imaging comes along with some sort of signal blurring, which we usually don't want to have at high resolution fMRI. However, we, on the other hand, also want to have short echo times and large signals. So we sometimes are forced to choose between having a blurry signal or having no signal. Of course, we choose the blurry signal. And a smart person once said that partial Fourier is something like heroin. You know, it's bad for you, but then you sit at a scanner and you just think you need it, and you promise yourself, yeah, just the once I will do it, because you always feel that you need to have a shorter echo time. So when you use partial Fourier, it's important that you consider how you reconstruct it. And there are different reconstruction algorithms. For example, there is conventional default zero filling, which is unfortunately the worst case. There is something like Magrosian, and there's something like POX. And Siemens has those parameters already implemented. And for unfortunate reasons, the number of iterations in my favorite reconstruction protocol, the POX stands for projection onto convex sets, is only 2. If you choose only 2 iterations, your reconstruction might be a few hundred milliseconds faster. However, especially at these large matrix sizes and long echo times that we are using at high resolution imaging, we might not really converge in just 2 iterations. So what I do is I usually change this to 8 for every participant in this IceConfig EVP file. This means that the reconstruction will be a tiny little bit slower, but at least we know that we are converging. And the effect of different partial Fourier reconstruction algorithms is shown in this phantom over here. So this is a kind of Aga phantom that has some B0 inhomogeneities. And you can see that the default, what Siemens does, is zero filling. So there is quite a little bit of blurring. So these little bubbles that we are kind of might represent the layers here are kind of looking elongated and blurry. If you use a Magrosian reconstruction algorithm, it looks much crisper. These bubbles are have their original shape. However, you see that the entire thing is much more sensitive to B0 inhomogeneities. We have these dark rings. In some areas, the signal is completely gone. So obviously, we don't want to use the Magrosian algorithm either. So the POX algorithm is some kind of compromise between all of them. And if you use 8 iterations, then you can see that here, for example, in the primary sensory cortex, these darker voxels here that probably refer to layer 4, are better visible if you use the POX as opposed to zero filling. So that's why I recommend you to use the POX reconstruction algorithm. I'm not sure how I am with timing. I think Farouk will just stop me. I think I'm maybe halfway through or so. The next thing that is important to consider when you want to set up your sequences is the shape of the EPI pulses. So basically telling us how fast we go through the k-space back and forth. So we usually start slow, then we accelerate, and then before we turn around, we slow down again a bit. And the kind of speed trajectory of how we go through k-space is usually determined by these EPI pulses. So there is a slope when we switch on the gradients. As soon as it's maximum strength, we have a flat top, and then it goes down. And there are about maybe like 7 parameters that determine when we start acquiring data, how big the amplitude is, what the ratio is of and the slope versus to the flat top, and so on. And these parameters are usually limited by the gradient power. And if you have a more expensive scanner or a different gradient coil, this power is slightly different. I think especially for the Terra, this is 80 millitesla per meter. Maybe for us it's 70 or something. It's roughly similar. The slew rate is in the range of 200 millitesla per millisecond. We are also limited, however, by the peripheral nerve stimulation. So even though our gradients are usually very potent and powerful, we cannot really use the entire performance of the gradients, because we would induce currents in, for example, the shoulder or the neck of the participant. And maybe you're familiar with these kind of error messages at the scanner that we cannot really execute it for safety reasons. Another limit that determines how fast we can go back and forth is given by the acoustic resonances. Especially for the SE72 coil that the Terras and most of the Siemens 7T scanners are equipped with, there are these acoustic resonances. This means that when you go back and forth k-space, you switch on the gradient and switch it off and on and off and on and off. And at a certain frequency where there are acoustic resonances, meaning that you put in power into the gradient coil, and this power kind of builds up and becomes stronger and stronger and stronger, and the whole system vibrates a lot, and it can also like break the coil, and certainly induces a lot of eddy currents, which can be problematic. Even though we would like to optimize these kind of shapes of the gradient pulses for our high resolution EPI purposes. The only parameter that Siemens gives us to change is the so-called the bandwidth. When you change the bandwidth, it's actually not only the bandwidth that you're changing, and the bandwidth is just the inverse of the duration of the ADCs, the analog to digital converters that the receiver coils have to acquire the signal. As soon as you change the bandwidth, you're also changing the duration of your flat top, you're changing the amplitude, and you're changing the ratio of the time you acquire data while you're still ramping up the ramp sampling, as it's called, and of course you're also changing the bandwidth. There is some sequences allow you to change the bandwidth independently of the ramp sampling. For example, some sequences have these free echo spacing parameter where you basically have the same echo spacing but then only change the ramp sampling, meaning the flat top and also the gradient magnitude. The thing that's usually not changed at all is the slew rate, so kind of the slope of how fast you switch on your gradient. And this, the speed of the switching is usually not limited by the performance of the gradients and the amplifiers, but it's usually limited by internal limits of the EPI sequence. We can change this in the sequence, not continuously, but some sequences allow to change the slope of the gradient pulses here and binary to have it fast or normal, for example. Some sequences also have the fast star. As soon as you change the echo time, it's a common misconception that the echo time actually does not change anything in the speed of how fast you go through your K-space. The echo time field in the sequence protocol editor task card only manages an amount of optional delay after your excitation of pulse before you start acquiring your data altogether. So the gradient shapes and going back and forth pattern is completely independent of your echo time field. All right. The next thing here that I want to show you is how the image quality is affected by changing the bandwidth. So here I put a person in and just varied the bandwidth on the top row and correspondingly the echo spacing, like the time that passes to go from one line in K-space to the next line changes. And you can see that especially in the second line, which is the TSNR, that TSNR is highly affected. Like if you have lower bandwidth and you go through K-space a bit slower, then you have the largest TSNR values. Here the signal intensity is the brightest and it kind of decreases. And as we go further and further to the right, you see that the artifact level also increases quite a bit. So if we have here echo spacings in the range of 0.9 milliseconds, which is very close to the acoustic resonances, you can see that the ghosts make the data almost unusable. However, it's not only the acoustic resonances that determine the signal quality here, because as you can see, the echo spacing is the same for these lower bandwidth too. Here the switching rate is completely identical, and the only thing that's different here is the ramp sampling and the duration of how long the ADCs are actually listening to signal coming in, and which affects your reconstruction and the Nyquist ghost correction, and then obviously affects the ghosting. So for any protocol that you're using, I would encourage you to play around with the bandwidth parameter. As you can see, it really affects your data quality a lot. Even more important than the switching rates of the actual EPI readout is the switching rates and the corresponding eddy currents and phase inconsistencies and artifacts of the Grappa reference data. So in order to get the Grappa kernel in the first place, the sequence, usually when you sit at the scanner, is acquiring at the beginning of every run so-called reference data. This means that you hear the scanner doing noises and going on and off, and without actually getting data yet, that the experiment hasn't started. And during this time, usually the missing K-space points are acquired for reference later. And there are different approaches on how you acquire these reference Grappa data. And I think maybe in the early days, the default way of doing things is a single shot, where you just once at the beginning not omit the missing k-space lines, but just acquire the entire k-space by going back and forth without missing the lines. For layer-dependent fMRI, however, this is absolutely not doable because it might take several hundred milliseconds to acquire the entire k-space. And with T2 star in the range of 25 milliseconds, the signal is completely decayed and gone before you even reach the k-space center. So that's why there are alternative ways of acquiring the missing k-space lines, and the go-to way how it was implemented in Siemens until a few years ago is a segmented approach, which is still, I think, the default way for doing things on the VB system, where you basically acquire every other k-space line and then acquire the missing ones in the next TR. And this, however, means that across two different TRs you acquire like the interleaved k-space points and are very sensitive to physiological noise. It's not a snapshot-like acquisition anymore. And that's why the reordering can be done to acquire first the k-space lines of individual k-space planes within the same TR with the so-called fleet approach, or you can also just use a flash approach. And these fleet or flash approaches are very helpful. However, they are rather new in the history of high-resolution fMRI, so it's not standardized yet on all the Siemens scanners. And you might be familiar with these kind of parameters, where you can choose between fleet, GRE, segmented single shot. Sometimes they don't call it GRE, but they call it flash. Like in this sequence on the VE, like the Terra platforms, you have different options. So many sequences have it because it's so important and improves the data quality so much. So I encourage you to use these options too. It's not standardized yet though. And the effect on here RT, our participant, can be seen here, for example, going back and forth between fleet and flash, where you see the fleet and flash difference is not that huge. However, if you use the default parameter from Siemens, the segmented EPI, you can see that it's not only the ghosting that's worse, it's also the noise level, especially when you look at the single slice results and the TSNR maps, the stability maps on the right. You can see that it's noisier, it's ghostier for the standard approach. If you use fleet or flash, you have much better like stabilities and also signal distributions. I find in my hands that flash is slightly better than fleet, but there's no like huge difference. You definitely shouldn't use the default, the segmented approach though. All right, maybe Farouk can tell me how far I am with time.
45 minutes in.
Okay, so I have 50 minutes left. Then maybe I skip the B0 related artifacts because I definitely want to show you how you do a retrospective reconstruction.
Renzo, can I ask something quickly?
Oh, yes, please.
So did I understand correct that fleet is a segmented acquisition of the k-space that happens within the same TR?
Absolutely correct, yes. Like usually, like the default way how it was done in the segmented approach is that you acquire like every odd number of k-space lines, 1 TR of the first slice, then the odd number of k-space lines in the second slice, then the odd number of k-space lines in the third slice, and so on. When you have it for all the slices, then you go to the next TR and acquire all the even numbers of the first slice, then the even numbers of the second slice, and so on. In fleet, you just change the looping structure here in the sense that you're doing like first the odd numbers of k-space lines in the first slice, then the even number of k-space lines in the first slice, then the odd number of k-space lines in the second slice, then the even numbers of k-space lines in the second slice, and so on. This has some other issues that you're basically exciting the same signal consecutively very fast. This means that you have some spin history effects, which I think from the voice, I think it was Miriam, which you might be very familiar with the kind of stripy patterns that are more visible than in these approaches. That's why Podimeni, who is a big advocate of the fleet approach, proposes that you have several dummy shots and use a very low flip angles for your fleet. Some sequences allow you to change it, some other sequences don't. Like as I said, I used the flash to begin with. For the high resolution kind of large coverage data that we are interested in, the flash is the way to go. If you have huge distortions and small field of views, then you might be better off with the fleet approach, because the fleet is EPI based and the flash is not EPI based. So you're kind of correcting the coil sensitivities of a undistorted image, flash image, with a distorted EPI, which can have troubles. Yes. I hope this answers the question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right, let's talk about retrospective reconstruction. As soon as you acquired your data and maybe your participant already went home, you can, and maybe you find out that you reconstructed your parameters in the wrong way, you can still reconstruct them retrospectively. And this might also be very helpful when you are, for example, not really sure if you should use the one reconstruction parameter or the other one, or if you so in this case, you can take the same raw case-based data and just reconstruct them in both ways, and then decide later on which kind of data set you want to use. So again, you can approach this kind of advanced tools by pushing the Control Escape button on your keyboard, which on VB17 gives you the XP window where you can type in run, and now you don't type in XBuilder, but you type in Twix. Again, on the Terra platform, you use the command tool and just type in Twix like that. This gives you something that looks like that. And here on the left, we have every kind of a bucket of data, both on the left and on the right. As soon as you select one, I would encourage you also to always select it on the left side. Because if you select it on the right side only, the retrospective reconstruction might pick the wrong one. It's a weird feature / bug, which is actually solved on the Terra platform. So the Terra platform, you don't need to worry about it. You can select it left or right. On the right specifically, you have the timestamps, which are helpful to select which run you're actually interested in. You can also look at the size. So for example, if you have 100 TRs, you get about 10 gigabytes for a slab acquisition of a 32-channel Nova coil. The ones in between are the frequency and phase adjusts that usually are required at the beginning of every run. So as soon as you select one, you can select this button over here, which gives you a menu down there, and there you have an edit box. As soon as you click the edit, it generates a temp file like that one, and this temp file contains literally all the important reconstruction parameters that you are allowed to manipulate. And as soon as you click the edit button, you again get an editor, which looks very similar to the IceConfig EVP at the beginning. In fact, it's also viewed with XBuilder. However, this does not only contain everything from the EVP that we manipulated at the beginning of the session, but it also contains all the very specific parameters for this sequence. So for example, when we are interested in EPI, we are particularly interested in, for example, EPI ghost correction, like delays between odd and even case-based lines. This is not the same for Flash, right? In Flash, you don't have this parameter altogether. So that's why we couldn't change this parameter at the beginning in the IceConfig, but now retrospectively we can. And the phase correction algorithm, for example, can be manipulated and selected with a binary code in numbers here. So the default that I find the best is 64. So this is 2 to the power of 60. This is 64 plus 4. So this is 68 together. This means that you're using a combination of algorithms, namely the cross correlation algorithm plus a global phase correction. You can play around with that. As soon as you change anything, or like in this case, I actually didn't change anything. I just left it and then wanted to reconstruct it in the original parameters that I had by just clicking the start button. As soon as you click the start button, you have this little green arrow, and as long as you have the green arrow, it means that the data are loaded to the MRIR from the database. As soon as the reconstruction started, you have this kind of laundry bucket over there, and when the reconstruction is done, you have a green check. When there's an arrow, then you usually have a exclamation mark or something. And I hope you don't have that a lot. As soon as you have this green check and you have your data, then the data set is automatically loaded into the patient browser. And you might be familiar with the fact that in Siemens you have the patient browser button on the keyboard over there. You can also just go to, I think, where is it, image, or there are several ways to navigate to the patient browser. I think in patient and then patient browser. If you go there, you get this window, which is the patient browser, and then you have a new time series. Even though you didn't acquire anything, you just reconstructed something. And in this case, we reconstructed that data set again. So it just copies the same file name, but you have the RR, which stands for retrospective reconstruction, on it. Now, however, we not only want to reconstruct the data as we had them, but we actually want to change something. For example, we want to change the way how we correct for the Nyquist ghost with the parameter that Siemens calls I-online phase correction algo. And to understand what this does, it's important to understand that in EPI we have, especially at high resolution EPIs, we might have like eddy currents, meaning that when you go in k-space from left to right, you are not completely mirrored to when you go right to left. And this might be spatially dependent. So for example, in your region of interest here, you go through k-space back and forth, and the peak of the k-space center is kind of shifted for every other line. So you would like to just take those lines and shift them back in like that. However, when we have high resolution, the eddy currents might be different in a region of no interest. And there, for example, we might have a shift that is not as big. And then obviously the algorithm doesn't really know what to do here, and you end up with very complex interference patterns and ghosts that can be sometimes not stable across time. And that's why it makes a lot of sense to play around with these different phase correction algorithms. And for example, the so-called local one is used by 64, which I would encourage you to use it. Most of the CMRR sequences, I think, use that by default. Here I want to show you just how different the data look. Like these are the same literal data that are just reconstructed with different like parameters. For example, the so-called global or pixel by pixel or no phase correction. Altogether, you see that the ghosting can make the data quite unusable. So if you have a lot of ghosting, you might want to play around with this parameter too. You can also change a lot of other parameters. For example, one that I sometimes play around with is the U reconstruction mode, which basically tells you if you want to reconstruct not only the magnitude data but the phase data. And again, this is additive binary code. So when you select 1 in this field, you're just reconstructing the magnitude. 2 would be just a phase. 8 would be both magnitude and phase. 4 would be real part, and then you can use combinations of those, like real and phase, if you have the 16 in there. And then you might end up with data like that to play around with. And I found a time now, so I have, I think, 3 minutes left, which just allows me to point your attention to another parameter that you can change in the retrospective reconstruction. For example, the so-called UC uncombined images. As soon as you switch that on and you have sum of squares reconstruction modes on there, you can basically recover individual images from the individual RF coils, which is not only sometimes used for debugging, but also for advanced coil reconstruction methods such as Stark or so, if you care about those kind of things and want to mess around with a lot of data. Because as soon as you reconstruct them for the individual channels and you have a 32-channel Nova coil, then this means that you have 30 times the amount of data. And just the export of those data sometimes takes several hours, which might annoy the technicians or the people who scan after you. All right, and with this I want to thank people I learned almost everything from, specifically Robin Heidemann from Siemens, Jonathan Polymeni about the grappa regularization, Peter Koopmans for comments on the partial Fourier that I talked about, Markus Streicher, Andreas Schäfer, Benedikt Poser, of course, and Kevin Setzenpop, especially for the tips about POCs. I thank you for your attention, and I welcome questions now.